The manicured lawns of Magnolia Court in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, stood as a testament to suburban stability, a quiet facade that effectively masked the brewing violence within the Bever household. On the night of July 22, 2015, that silence was permanently shattered by a faint, desperate 911 call that led police to a scene of unparalleled brutality. Inside the residence, officers discovered a slaughterhouse where 5 family members lay dead, victims of a frenzied attack involving dozens of stab wounds. The perpetrators were not invading strangers, but the family's eldest sons, including 16-year-old Michael Bever. As the community of Broken Arrow reeled from the revelation that a local teenager had participated in the methodical execution of his parents and younger siblings, detectives searched for a motive in a house filled with ammunition and tactical gear. The answer lay hidden in a series of handwritten journals. These diaries did not contain typical teenage angst, but rather a cold, calculated blueprint for mass murder intended to rival historical tragedies. It was the reading of these specific, premeditated entries that would eventually silence the courtroom, revealing that the 16-year-old had not just snapped, but had been rehearsing for the apocalypse of his own family. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. The residence at 709 Magnolia Court in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, presented an architectural mask to the outside world that was as sturdy as it was deceptive. To the casual observer walking the manicured streets of the Indian Springs subdivision, the 2-story brick home was indistinguishable from its neighbors. It was a structure of affluence and suburban stability, housing a family that seemed to have achieved the American aspiration of privacy and self-sufficiency. However, the facade of the Bever family was constructed with a meticulous desperation, designed not just to keep the world out, but to keep a volatile reality contained within. David and April Bever moved their growing family to Broken Arrow in 2007, relocating from Texas to the quiet suburb southeast of Tulsa. David, a technology professional working for major corporations like HP and later engaging in remote IT work, provided a comfortable financial baseline that allowed the family to exist in relative isolation. The house they purchased was spacious, implying a life of comfort for their 7 children. Yet, as years passed, the neighbors began to notice that the house on Magnolia Court functioned less like a home and more like a fortress. The isolation was deliberate and total. The Bever children, ranging in age from 2 to 18, were homeschooled, but the curriculum extended far beyond textbooks. They were schooled in silence and invisibility. Neighbors would later recount that they rarely saw the children playing outside. When the siblings did appear, they were often observed walking in a single file, heads down, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might be watering a lawn or checking the mail. They were discouraged from fraternizing with local children, and the perimeter of the property became a rigid boundary line that was not to be crossed. Behind the front door, the atmosphere was governed by an oppressive authoritarianism spearheaded by David Bever. Accounts that surfaced later described a household where verbal and psychological abuse were routine mechanisms of control. David was painted as a tyrannical figure, a man who demanded absolute obedience and feared the influence of the outside world. He was paranoid about government overreach and societal decay, instilling a worldview in his children that everyone outside their walls was a potential threat. April Bever, while often described as a victim of David's domineering personality, was also an enforcer of the house rules. She was the gatekeeper who ensured the isolation remained airtight. In this pressure cooker, the two eldest sons, 18-year-old Robert and 16-year-old Michael, began to forge a bond rooted not in brotherly love, but in shared trauma and a developing toxic pathology. They were roomed together, creating a private ecosystem where their resentment could fester and mutate. The layout of the house meant that the boys were often separated from their younger siblings, Crystal, Daniel, Christopher, Victoria, and Autumn. This physical separation within the home mirrored the emotional chasm developing in the brothers' minds. They began to view their parents not as guardians but as wardens, and their younger siblings not as innocents, but as favoured pawns of the wardens, receiving slightly more affection or leniency, which only fueled the older boys' bitterness. The resentment was not merely teenage rebellion. It was a deep existential hatred of their circumstances. Deprived of normal social outlets, smartphones, or unmonitored internet access, Robert and Michael turned inward. However, David Bever's strict control over technology had loopholes. The boys managed to access the internet, and specifically, the darker corners of the web, where they could research serial killers, mass shooters, and the mechanics of death. The digital world became their only window, and unfortunately, they looked out upon a landscape of violence which they began to romanticize as the ultimate expression of power and freedom. Robert, the elder, was the architect of their descent, but Michael, at 16, was a willing and eager acolyte. The dynamic between them was complex. While Robert often took the lead in the logistical planning, Michael's journals and later confessions revealed a mind that was equally engaged in the fantasy of slaughter. They fed off each other's nihilism. In the shared space of their bedroom, the air was thick with whispered plans and the glow of computer screens displaying bulk orders for tactical gear. The facade of the perfect family was maintained through a rigorous suppression of individuality. The children were reportedly forbidden from speaking without permission and were restricted in their movements around the house. Food was sometimes used as a tool of discipline. This environment stripped the boys of their empathy. To survive the psychological rigors of the Bever household, they learned to detach. They dehumanized their parents as a defense mechanism, but that dehumanization eventually spread to everyone, including their 5 younger siblings. In the months leading up to July 2015, the planning moved from abstract fantasy to concrete logistics. This transition is where the story shifts from a tragedy of abuse to a clinical study in premeditated patricide and matricide. The brothers began to acquire an arsenal. Because firearms were difficult for them to obtain without raising immediate alarms or requiring parental consent they could not get, they turned to edged weapons. They utilized the family's Amazon account to order combat knives, protective Kevlar sleeves, body armor, and masks. It is a chilling testament to the family's disconnection that these packages arrived at the front door of 709 Magnolia Court without triggering an intervention. David and April Bever, presumably monitoring the household finances, either missed the purchases or were deceived by the boys regarding the contents of the boxes. The brothers stockpiled these items in their room, hiding them amidst the clutter of a house that was slowly becoming a hoarding situation. The interior of the home, unbeknownst to the pristine exterior, was chaotic and cramped with accumulated possessions, further adding to the claustrophobic stress placed on the occupants. The journals kept by the boys, specifically the digital entries recovered later by forensics, provide the most harrowing insight into this period. They did not view the impending violence as a mere escape attempt. They viewed it as the launch of a career. They wanted to be famous. They idolized the perpetrators of the Columbine massacre and the Aurora Theater shooting, calculating that a higher body count would grant them a higher tier of godhood in the pantheon of killers. The plan was grandiose and delusional. Kill the family, steal the family vehicle, and drive across the country, killing randomly to achieve a body count of 50 or more. Michael Bever, at 16, was at a developmental crossroads where identity is usually formed through social interaction, peer groups, and academic achievement. Denied all of these, he formed his identity around the concept of the godlike killer. His resentment toward his parents was absolute. He blamed them for his social retardation, his lack of skills, and his profound loneliness. But the transmutation of that blame into a desire to slaughter his 5-year-old sister indicates a complete collapse of moral reasoning. In his worldview, the younger siblings were liabilities, snitches, or simply biomass that would add to the tally. The duality of their existence in the weeks prior to the event was stark. By day, they were the quiet, awkward Bever boys who performed their chores and completed their homeschool lessons. By night, they were tactical commanders reviewing the layout of their own home, as if it were an enemy compound. They mapped out the sleeping arrangements. They calculated the timing. They discussed who would take which room and who would execute which family member. They practiced moving through the house in the dark, silent and lethal. One of the most disturbing aspects of the background to this case was the sheer mundanity of the catalyst. There was no single explosive argument or inciting incident on the day of the planned attack that pushed them over the edge. It was simply the schedule. They had set a date. They had saved money from odd jobs and petty thefts from their parents to fund their escape. The inevitability of the act was driven by a cold, bureaucratic adherence to their own plan. They had written it down, and therefore it had to happen. The diary entries and digital documents served as the manifesto for this planned atrocity. They were not scribbles of rage, but typed, formatted documents of intent. They catalogued their grievances with a clinical detachment. They mocked their family members in prose, describing them as sheep waiting for the wolves. This documentation was intended for a future audience. They anticipated that after their cross-country rampage, they would either be killed or captured, and these journals would be the artifacts that media outlets would pore over. They were writing their own true crime legacy before a single drop of blood had been spilled. The relationship between the brothers and their younger siblings requires specific examination to understand the horror of the intent. Crystal, age 13, was the closest in age to Michael. One might expect a bond there, but instead, she was viewed as a primary target. Daniel, 12, and Christopher, 7, were seen as physical obstacles that needed to be neutralized quickly. Victoria, 5, and Autumn, 2, were viewed with such callous indifference that their planned deaths were treated as mere housekeeping chores to ensure no witnesses remained. The brothers had successfully convinced themselves that they were a separate species from the rest of the family. The role of the parents, David and April, in creating this monster cannot be overstated, yet it remains a complex puzzle. While David was the primary source of fear, April's role was more ambiguous. Was she a fellow victim of domestic control, too paralyzed to protect her children? Or was she a participant in the neglect that severed the boy's connection to reality, the condition of the house, which would later be revealed to police, suggested a collective mental health crisis affecting the adults that trickled down to the children. Piles of garbage, unsanitary bathrooms, and a general state of decay inside the walls of the expensive home pointed to deep dysfunction. In this environment, Robert and Michael's plan offered them a perverse form of agency. For the first time in their lives, they were making decisions. They were buying things. They were planning a road trip. The murder of their family was, in their warped logic, simply the necessary demolition required to clear the path for their new life. They did not plan to kill because they lost control. They planned to kill to take control. As July 22, 2015 approached, the tension in the boys' bedroom was palpable only to them. To the rest of the house, the rhythm of life continued. David worked on his computer. April managed the younger children. The neighbors mowed their lawns. No one saw the armor being tested. No one heard the whispers about the start of the ride. The silence of the Bever house, usually a sign of David's strict discipline, had transformed into the quiet before an ambush. The final element of the background was the illusion of success the family projected. David Bever talked to colleagues about his bright children. April Bever maintained a polite distance from neighbors. They were unaware that the strict parameters they had set for their sons had not contained the boys' rebellion, but had compressed it into a diamond-hard core of hate. The parents believed they were raising children protected from the sins of the world, unaware that they were raising two young men who were actively studying the sins of the world to replicate them with greater efficiency. The journals, when finally revealed in the silence of a courtroom, would strip away every layer of this suburban defense. They would show that the massacre was not a sudden snap of sanity, but a long, slow, and deliberate construction project. The boys had built a slaughterhouse inside their minds long before they turned their home into one. The tragedy was not just in the loss of life that was to come, but in the total, undetected rotting of the family soul that preceded it. The 16-year-old Michael did not just wake up a killer. He was forged into one by the pressure of a perfect facade and the hidden resentment that had nowhere else to go but out through the blade of a knife. The night of July 22, 2015, in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, was heavy with the humid stillness characteristic of midsummer in the American Midwest. To the residents of Magnolia Court, a quiet cul-de-sac in the Indian Springs subdivision, the two-story brick home at number 709 projected an image of suburban normalcy. Inside, however, the Bever family was unknowingly minutes away from a carefully orchestrated termination event. The household consisted of Father David Bever, Mother April Bever, and their 7 children ranging in age from 2 to 18. By midnight, 5 family members would be dead, 1 would be clinging to life with critical injuries, and 2 would be in police custody. The architects of this destruction were the 2 eldest sons, 18-year-old Robert Beaver and 16-year-old Michael Beaver. The sequence of violence began shortly before 11:30 p.m. Unlike crimes of passion that erupt spontaneously, this event was the physical manifestation of a strategy documented extensively in digital journals and hard drives. The brothers had accumulated a stockpile of weaponry, purchasing knives and hatchets online alongside tactical body armor. Their objective was not merely the elimination of their immediate family, but the initiation of a cross-country killing spree intended to surpass the notoriety of the Columbine massacre and the Aurora theater shooting. The plan required the swift, silent execution of the 7 occupants of the house to secure the family vehicle and firearms. The initial phase commenced in the shared bedroom of the 2 brothers. They donned their Kevlar-reinforced armor and armed themselves. The plan dictated a stealthy approach, utilizing deception to isolate their victims. 13-year-old Crystal Bever became the first target. Robert and Michael lured her into their bedroom under the guise of wanting to show her something on a computer. The moment she entered the room, The clinical detachment of the planning phase dissolved into frenetic violence. Crystal was restrained and slashed across the throat. However, the anatomy of the attack failed to yield immediate silence. Crystal fought back, her screams piercing the quiet of the home and alerting the other residents. This disruption of the brothers' timeline triggered a chaotic escalation. David Beaver, 52 years old, rushed toward the bedroom in response to his daughter's distress. He was met by his sons in the hallway. The physical disparity between the father and the armed teenagers resulted in a brutal close-quarters struggle. David was overpowered and subjected to 28 distinct stab wounds. As the patriarch fell in the hallway, the structure of the family's defense collapsed. Simultaneously, 44-year-old April Bever navigated the chaos, attempting to aid her children. The evidence suggests a frantic pursuit through the corridors of the home. April was intercepted and attacked with a ferocity that surpassed even the assault on her husband, sustaining 48 stab wounds. The sheer volume of trauma inflicted on the parents indicated a shift from the brothers' calculated efficiency to a state of overkill. While the parents were being incapacitated, Crystal Bever, bleeding profusely from the neck and torso, managed to escape the immediate vicinity of the bedroom. She located a cell phone and made a call that would become the pivotal piece of evidence in the timeline of the night. At 11:33 p.m., the Broken Arrow Emergency Dispatch Center received a call, classified initially as an open line. The dispatcher heard a female voice whispering, struggling to articulate amidst the background noise of a violent struggle. The recording of this call captures the auditory footprint of the slaughter. Crystal can be heard pleading for help, stating that her brothers were attacking the family. In the background, male voices, identified later as Robert and Michael, can be heard shouting. At one point, a voice feigns the distress of a victim, screaming, "Please don't kill me." A tactical ruse intended to confuse the dispatcher or lure other hiding siblings into the open. The ruse failed to deter law enforcement. Recognizing the severity of the situation, the dispatcher upgraded the call to a priority emergency, dispatching units to 709 Magnolia Court with the advisory of a stabbing in progress. As the first patrol cars initiated their response, the brothers turned their attention to the remaining witnesses. 12-year-old Daniel and 7-year-old Christopher had barricaded themselves inside a bathroom. The forensic reconstruction of the scene indicates that the brothers employed deception to breach this barrier. Michael, mimicking a panicked tone, pleaded with his younger brothers to open the door, claiming he was fleeing the attackers. When the lock was disengaged, the brothers entered. Daniel and Christopher were executed in the bathroom. The autopsy reports would later detail multiple sharp force injuries to both children, confirming they had no avenue for defense. 5-year-old Victoria Bever was found in a bedroom, also deceased from sharp force trauma. The brothers had moved room to room, systematically clearing the house as if it were a tactical training ground. The only family member left physically unharmed was 2-year-old Autumn Bever, who was asleep in an upstairs bedroom. The brothers had allegedly intended to kill her as well, referring to the act in their planning as killing the baby. But the arrival of law enforcement interrupted the final phase of their domestic purge. Sergeant Thomas Cooper and Officer Eric Bentz were among the first responders to arrive at the scene. The timeline from the 911 connection to police arrival was rapid, a factor that likely saved Crystal Bever's life. As the officers approached the residence, the exterior offered few clues to the carnage inside, save for the eerie silence that had replaced the screaming heard on the dispatch tape. The front door stood ajar. Upon crossing the threshold, the officers were immediately assaulted by the overwhelming sensory reality of the crime scene. The smell of fresh blood, metallic and cloying, permeated the air. To the immediate left of the entryway, the body of David Bever lay in a pool of blood. The officers, weapons drawn, initiated a tactical sweep of the residence, announcing their presence. There was no verbal response from the perpetrators. The visual landscape of the home was horrific. Blood, spatter covered the walls, floors, and furniture, telling the story of the struggle and the pursuit. As officers moved deeper into the house, they discovered the body of April Bever. Near the entryway, they located Crystal. She was critical, suffering from slash wounds to her throat and stab wounds to her abdomen and arms, yet she remained conscious enough to identify her brothers as the assailants. She indicated that they had fled out the back door. Paramedics were immediately summoned into the hot zone to extract Crystal. The priority shifted instantly from a rescue operation to a manhunt. The officers cleared the remainder of the house, confirming the deaths of Daniel, Christopher, and Victoria. The discovery of the unharmed toddler, Autumn, provided a jarring counterpoint to the surrounding brutality. She was quickly removed from the scene and placed into protective custody. The perimeter was established rapidly. A canine unit arrived to track the scent from the rear of the property. The brothers had exited the house through a side door, discarding some of their equipment as they fled into the wooded area adjacent to the subdivision. Their plan to steal the family car and acquire guns had been thwarted by the swift police response and the activation of the home's alarm system, or perhaps simply by the exhaustion of the physical act of killing. The K9 unit tracked the brothers through the dense brush behind the neighborhood. Approximately 100 yards from the residence, the dog alerted. Officers illuminated the area with tactical lights, revealing Robert and Michael Bever lying in the dirt. They were still wearing their body armor. They were covered in the blood of their family members. The arrest was effected without further violence. The brothers surrendered, complying with commands to show their hands and lay prone. As they were handcuffed and searched, officers noted a chilling demeanor. There was no panic, no hysteria, and no apparent remorse. Robert Bever, the 18-year-old ringleader, appeared stoic. Michael, the 16-year-old, was equally subdued. They were marched out of the woods and placed into separate patrol vehicles. Back inside the residence, detectives began the grim task of processing the scene. It was a forensic nightmare. The sheer number of stab wounds across 5 victims and 1 survivor exceeded 100 separate injuries. The layout of the bodies suggested a hunt, confirming the premeditated nature of the attack. Investigators located the collection of knives and hatchets, some bent or broken from the force of the blows. Crucially, the police recovered the digital evidence that would contextualize the slaughter. In the brothers' shared bedroom, amidst the clutter of teenagers' lives, lay the computer and USB drives containing their manifesto. This documentation revealed that the date had been chosen specifically. They had ordered the ammunition for firearms they intended to steal, and the delivery was scheduled for the following day. The knives were a fallback, a necessary tool to acquire the guns that would fuel the larger massacre. The immediate police interviews with the brothers in the hours following their arrest provided a window into their psychology. Robert Bever spoke with a clinical detachment that disturbed even veteran homicide detectives. He described the planning as a logistical challenge, detailing how they had saved money from odd jobs to purchase the armor and weapons online. He expressed disappointment, not in the loss of his family, but in the failure to execute the subsequent phases of the plan. The diary entries and digital logs corroborated this. outlining a desire for fame through infamy. They had studied mass shooters, analyzing response times and body counts, aiming to optimize their own lethality. The 16-year-old Michael provided a narrative that mirrored his brother's, but with a slightly different affect. He described the pact they had made, a blood oath to sever ties with the world by destroying their origin. He detailed the trickery used to lure his siblings, confirming the specific deceptions heard on the 911 call and deduced from the crime scene. As the sun rose over Broken Arrow on the morning of July 23rd, the full scope of the tragedy became visible. The police tape cordoned off the entire cul-de-sac. Crime scene technicians in white protective suits moved in and out of the house, cataloguing the evidence of a family annihilated from within. The contrast between the mundane suburban exterior and the abattoir inside became the defining image of the case. The survival of Crystal Bever became the central miracle of the investigation. Despite severe blood loss and a throat wound that threatened her airway, she stabilized at the hospital. Her testimony would later provide the emotional anchor for the prosecution, but on that night, her survival was a tactical failure for the brothers. It was her ability to reach the phone, to press the buttons, and to whisper into the line that summoned the forces that stopped the brothers before they could vanish into the night. The community reaction was immediate shock, followed by a search for answers that the brothers were all too willing to provide in their confessions. They did not claim abuse or sudden madness. They claimed ambition. They wanted to be known as gods of destruction. The diary entry, later referenced in court proceedings, encapsulated this motivation with a chilling finality. It was not a rambunctious venting of teenage angst, but a blueprint for domestic erasure. In the days that followed, the forensic analysis of the house at 709 Magnolia Court continued. Every room held evidence. The footprint analysis showed the path of the killers moving from the attack on Crystal to the parents in the hallway, to the bathroom where the boys died, and finally to the bedroom of the 5-year-old. The blood flow patterns confirmed the sequence of events constructed by the medical examiner. David Bever had died fighting, his defensive wounds indicating a desperate attempt to disarm his sons. April Bever had died running, trying to reach her children. The younger children had died waiting, trapped by the deception of their older brothers. The tactical gear worn by the brothers was processed and found to be effective. They had sustained no significant injuries during the assault on their father. The disparity in force was absolute. The planning had accounted for the physical advantage of the father, neutralizing it with surprise, numbers, and armor. The arrest of Robert and Michael Bever concluded the immediate threat, but the investigation into the why was just beginning. The police response, while rapid and professional, could only limit the scope of the tragedy, not prevent it. The speed of the violence, executing a plan months in the making, outpaced the reaction time of the emergency services. The transition from a quiet family home to a crime scene of national headline proportions took less than 20 minutes. As the detectives reviewed the timeline, the 911 call remained the most haunting artifact. It captured the exact moment the brothers' fantasy of godlike control collided with the reality of human suffering. The recording documented the transition from the silent planning of the diary to the screaming reality of the slaughter. The brothers sat in interrogation rooms, stripped of their armor and weapons, reduced to 2 teenagers in hospital scrubs, recounting the massacre with the dry precision of an after-action report. The silence they had sought to impose on their family had been achieved, but it was the silence of the grave, broken only by the sirens that signaled the end of their freedom. The final entry of their diary had been written in the blood of their kin, but the concluding chapter would be written by the judicial system of Oklahoma. The atmosphere inside the Tulsa County District Court in the spring of 2018 was heavy with a silence that felt less like tranquility and more like the holding of breath. The trial of Michael Bever, who had been 16 years old on the night he and his older brother Robert decimated their family in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, had reached its most pivotal juncture. The sentencing phase was not merely a procedural formality, it was a battle over the nature of evil itself. The defense sought to paint a portrait of a malleable, abused child under the thrall of a psychopath, while the prosecution prepared to unveil the cold, hard text of a mind that had calculated fratricide with the precision of an accountant. Judge Sharon Holmes presided over a room where the air conditioning hummed beneath the rustle of legal pads. Michael Bever, now 19, sat at the defense table. His demeanor throughout the proceedings had been unsettlingly vacant, his face a mask of passive observation that betrayed little of the carnage he had helped facilitate. The jury, a weary collection of citizens who had already absorbed the gruesome autopsy reports of 5 dead family members, looked toward the podium where District Attorney Steve Kunzweiler stood ready to dismantle the defense's narrative. The defense attorney, Corbin Brewster, had spent days meticulously constructing the puppet theory. Brewster argued that Michael was not a ringleader, but a follower, a boy trapped in a house of horrors where his older brother, Robert Bever, served as both captor and commander. The defense relied heavily on the psychological concept of folie à deux, a shared psychosis where a dominant partner imposes delusional systems upon a submissive one. They spoke of the verbal and physical abuse the Bever children endured at the hands of their father, David Bever, painting a picture of a 16-year-old boy who saw his 18-year-old brother not as a co-conspirator, but as a misguided savior. Brewster's closing arguments for leniency hinged on the idea that Michael's participation was reluctant, a frantic attempt to appease the only ally he had in a terrifying home environment. The defense paraded psychological evaluations, suggesting that Michael's emotional development had been stunted, that his capacity for independent judgment had been eroded by years of isolation and Robert's apocalyptic influence. They asked the jury to look at the defendant and see a child who had made a catastrophic error in judgment, not a monster born of malice. They argued that a sentence of life without parole would be a condemnation of a boy who never truly had a chance to be anything other than Robert's shadow. But the prosecution had a different story to tell, and they had the evidence to ground it in absolute, terrifying reality. District Attorney Kunzweiler did not deal in theoretical psychologies or abstract family dynamics. He dealt in the physical reality of the crime scene and the digital reality of the planning. The state's argument was clinical and brutal. Michael Bever was not a passenger. He was a co-pilot. Kunzweiler began by revisiting the sheer mechanics of the slaughter. He reminded the courtroom of the autopsy results, reciting the number of stab wounds with a rhythmic, devastating cadence. David Bever, the father, sustained 28 distinct wounds. April Bever, the mother, sustained 48. The brothers, Daniel and Christopher, and the sister Victoria, were butchered with a ferocity that required active, sustained physical exertion. The prosecutor paused, letting the numbers hang in the air. He noted that such a volume of violence was not the work of a reluctant participant. It was the work of someone committed to the act, someone who did not stop when the screaming began, but who chased his siblings down. The prosecutor then turned to the surviving sister, whose testimony had earlier shattered the composure of the gallery. She had described Michael, her brother, tricking her into opening the door by pretending to be in distress, only to attack her. This act of deception, Kunzweiler argued, required presence of mind. It required a suppression of empathy that contradicted the defense's portrayal of a panicked, confused child. This was a tactical maneuver executed by a 16-year-old intent on leaving no witnesses. However, the most damning evidence was not the blood, but the ink. The Bever brothers had not merely acted on impulse. They had documented their descent into darkness. They had kept journals and digital notes, a manifesto of their intent to become gods through the act of killing. It was here, in the reading of these diaries, that the courtroom's temperature seemed to drop. Kunzweiler approached the jury box, holding the transcripts of the brothers' plans. The documents were a mixture of juvenile angst and industrial-scale homicide planning. They detailed the acquisition of weapons, the logistics of body disposal, and the timeline of the attack. But it was the tone of the writing that stripped away the defense's narrative of reluctance. The prosecutor began to read an entry written in the days leading up to the murders. The voice in the diary was not fearful or coerced. It was eager. The entry detailed a desire to exceed the body counts of famous historical killers. It spoke of the family not as loved ones or even as oppressors, but as statistics, the first hurdles in a cross-country killing spree designed to grant the brothers infamy. The writing possessed a clinical detachment that mirrored the way one might plan a grocery trip or a vacation, yet the subject matter was the extermination of their own bloodline. The room fell into a profound silence as Kunzweiler read a passage where the author, identified through handwriting analysis and context as Michael, expressed a frustration not with the morality of the impending act, but with the logistical delays in carrying it out. The text revealed a 16-year-old who was impatient to begin the slaughter. There was no hesitation, no sorrow, no entry begging for an alternative solution. There was only the cold calculation of efficiency. Then came the final entry, the piece of evidence that effectively silenced the room and sucked the oxygen from the defense's case. It was a reflection on the upcoming event, written with a chilling lucidity. The entry did not speak of escaping abuse. It spoke of acquiring fame. It detailed the specific anticipation of the kill, the expectation of the rush. The writer mused on the legacy they would leave, comparing themselves to gods who held the power of life and death. As Kunzweiler read the words, the image of the scared, abused child dissolved. In its place sat a young man who had looked at his 5-year-old sister and saw only an obstacle to his own notoriety. The diary entry described the planned murders as the opening ceremonies of their new lives. It was a phrase that resonated with a sickening thud against the wood-panelled walls of the courtroom. Opening ceremonies. The slaughter of a family was not a desperate escape. It was a debut performance. The prosecutor lowered the transcript. He looked at the jury, then at Michael Beaver. The silence that followed was total. Even the shuffling of feet and the clearing of throats ceased. The diary had bridged the gap between the thought and the act, proving that the violence was not a snap decision made under duress, but a destination Michael had been walking toward for months, willing and wide-eyed. Kunzweiler argued that while Robert may have been the architect, Michael was the willing contractor. He pointed out that Michael had opportunities to stop the plan. He had opportunities to warn his siblings. He had opportunities to call the police. Instead, he had sharpened knives. He had donned the armor. He had stood by the door and waited for the signal. The diary proved that his internal monologue was not one of conflict, but of anticipation. The defense attempted to redirect, to contextualize the writings as the fantasy of a warped mind, but the damage was done. The vivid description of the final entry lingered in the minds of the jurors. It was difficult to reconcile the image of a victimized child with the author of those words. The clinical precision of the planning, the purchasing of Kevlar, the amassing of ammunition, the mapping of the escape route, spoke of a cognitive maturity that the defense claimed Michael lacked. The judge, listening intently, seemed to weigh the gravity of the written words against the age of the defendant. The law required a consideration of youth. The Supreme Court had ruled that juveniles were constitutionally different from adults, less culpable and more capable of change. But the brutality of the Bever case tested the limits of that mercy. The diary entry suggested a depth of depravity that age alone could not explain away. As the sentencing phase drew to a close, the courtroom was left to grapple with the duality of the defendant. Was he the boy who cried when the police dog stormed the house, or was he the aspiring serial killer who wrote of slaughtering his kin for headlines? The prosecution argued that the diary was the tiebreaker. It was the window into the soul that no psychological evaluation could cloud. It showed a boy who wanted to be a killer. The reading of the final entry served as the crescendo of the trial. It laid bare the premeditation in a way that photographs of the crime scene could not. Photographs showed the result. The diary showed the intent. It stripped Michael Bever of his passive defense and placed the knife firmly back in his hand. When the jury eventually returned with their recommendation, the echo of those diary entries seemed to reverberate through the verdict. They found him guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. The sentencing that followed, life with the possibility of parole, a small concession to his age that distinguished him from his brother Robert, who received life without parole, did little to erase the horror of what had been read aloud. The documentary record of that day highlights the unique power of the written word in a criminal trial. In a case drowning in blood and forensic data, it was a few paragraphs scribbled in a notebook that provided the most terrifying glimpse into the abyss. The diary did not just chronicle a crime. It revealed a complete inversion of human morality, where a 16-year-old boy looked at his family and saw not people, but props in a tragedy of his own making. The silence that followed the reading of that final entry was not just the silence of a courtroom. It was the silence of a community confronting the reality that some nightmares are not dreamt, but planned, written down, and executed by the children living next door. The focus shifted to the technicalities of the sentencing hearing that followed the guilty verdict. Under Oklahoma law and federal precedents regarding juvenile offenders, the court had to conduct a specialized hearing to determine if Michael was irreparably corrupt or if there was hope for rehabilitation. This was the battleground where the diary became the weapon of choice for the state. Dr. Robertson, a defense expert, took the stand to argue that Michael's brain was still developing. He spoke of the frontal cortex, of impulse control, of the malleability of the teenage mind. He showed brain scans and cited studies on juvenile development, attempting to create a biological barrier between Michael and the full weight of his actions. He argued that the Michael who wrote the diary was a product of his environment, a mirror reflecting Robert's madness, and that if removed from that toxic influence, the mirror could reflect something else. But on cross-examination, Kunzweiler returned to the diary. He asked the expert if a developing brain could meticulously plan a mass casualty event with such specific logistical details. He asked if impulse control issues explained a plan that was refined over weeks and months. The prosecutor used the diary to cut through the abstract neuroscience. He argued that while a teenager might be impulsive, the Bever plan was the opposite of impulse. It was a siege. The prosecution also called upon the first responders to testify during this phase. They described the scene in the Bever home not as a chaotic explosion of rage, but as a hunting ground. They described how the brothers had prepared their gear. They described the silence of the house when they entered, a silence achieved through the systematic elimination of the occupants. These testimonies served to reinforce the narrative of the diary, that this was a professional operation in the minds of the perpetrators. The climax of the sentencing hearing was the victim impact statement from the surviving sister. Though she did not speak the words herself in the courtroom, her statement was read into the record. It described a life shattered, a physical and emotional scarring that would never heal. She spoke of the brother she thought she knew, and the monster he revealed himself to be in the hallway that night. Her words provided the emotional counterweight to the defense's clinical arguments. While the defense spoke of neurons and chemicals, the survivor spoke of betrayal and blood. The judge's final decision to grant the possibility of parole was a controversial one, rooted in the strict legal interpretations of juvenile culpability. It was a recognition that a 16-year-old is not an 18-year-old in the eyes of the law. However, the sentence ensured that Michael Bever would spend the vast majority of his life behind bars, with the earliest possibility of release decades in the future. The trial of Michael Bever remains a case study in the intersection of juvenile justice and extreme violence. It forced the legal system to ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil in children. Is a 16-year-old who plans a sibling slaughter a victim of his biology and environment? Or is he a fully realized agent of destruction? The diary entries remain the most haunting artifact of the case. They are the permanent record of a bond between brothers that was forged in hatred. They serve as a reminder that the most dangerous weapon in the Bever home was not the knives they purchased, but the shared delusion they cultivated. A delusion that was written down, line by line, until it spilled off the page and into the real world. The final entry, read in that quiet courtroom, did not just silence the room. It signaled the end of the Bever family and the beginning of a long, dark imprisonment for the boy who wanted to be a god but became only an inmate. In the years since the trial, the Broken Arrow community has tried to heal. The house where the murders took place was eventually demolished, the ground cleared as if to wipe the stain from the earth. A park and garden were dedicated in its place, a memorial to the 5 lives lost. But for those who sat in the courtroom, for the jurors who held the transcripts, and for the legal teams who argued the fate of a teenager, the memory of the diary remains indelible. It stands as a testament to the fact that the darkest corners of the human psyche can be found in the handwriting of a child. The narrative of the Bever murders is often dominated by the sheer scale of the tragedy. 5 dead, the parents and 3 siblings. But the legal narrative, the story told in the courtroom, was a story about the mind of Michael Bever. It was a story told through the contrast between the defense's quiet, broken client and the prosecution's loud, boastful diarist. In the end, the jury and the judge had to decide which version of Michael was real. The sentence suggests they saw both: the child who deserved a sliver of hope, and the killer who deserved a lifetime of cages. The proceedings concluded with the sheriff's deputies shackling Michael Bever, the metallic click of the restraints the only sound following the judge's final words. He was led out of the courtroom, away from the lawyers, away from the grieving relatives, and away from the diary that had sealed his fate. The notebook, now evidence exhibit number, remained behind, a silent paper witness to the slaughter that had been planned by a 16-year-old boy in the dark. The aftermath of the violence in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, extended far beyond the yellow tape surrounding the residence at 709 Magnolia Court, while the immediate horror of July 22, 2015, involved the physical brutality committed by 18-year-old Robert Bever and his 16-year-old brother Michael. The enduring legacy of the crime is found in the boxes of evidence that sat on the prosecution's table. Among them were the journals that dismantled the defense's narrative of a snapping point and replaced it with a portrait of cold, calculated malice. The psychological profile emerging from these documents painted Michael Bever not merely as a follower of his older brother, but as a willing participant in a shared delusion of grandeur, driven by a desire for infamy that eclipsed any biological imperative of familial bonding. Clinical analysis of the Bever brothers revealed a disturbing dyad, often referred to in psychiatric circles as folie à deux, or shared psychosis, though the premeditation detailed in their writings suggests a more psychopathic detachment than a break from reality. Forensic psychiatrists who examined Michael noted a profound lack of effective empathy. In the quiet, sterile environment of the courtroom, the reading of the diary entries severed the emotional connection between the jury and the defendant. The entries did not reflect a terrified child coerced by a domineering sibling, but rather a partner in crime who fantasized about the statistical probability of surpassing the victim counts of historical mass killers. The brothers had not only planned the slaughter of their parents, David and April, and their siblings Daniel, Christopher, and Victoria, but they had also meticulously logged their intention to weaponize the family Lincoln SUV to run down strangers, aiming for a body count of 50. The diary effectively silenced the room because it stripped away the ambiguity of adolescence. It was the manifesto of a predator in a waiting state. This documentation of intent became the fulcrum upon which the juvenile justice arguments pivoted. Michael Bever's case became a litmus test for the application of Miller v. Alabama within the conservative legal landscape of Oklahoma. The Supreme Court ruling, which forbids mandatory life sentences without parole for juvenile offenders, forced the prosecution to navigate a complex moral and legal corridor. The state had to prove that Michael was irredeemable, a concept that sits uncomfortably within a justice system theoretically designed to rehabilitate minors. Defense attorneys argued that Michael's brain development was incomplete and that he was the product of a toxic, abusive home environment where the parents were distant and the older brother was a manipulative influence. However, the sheer volume of logistical planning found in the bedroom shared by the brothers countered the narrative of impulsivity. The jury was tasked with deciding if the 16-year-old who stabbed his younger siblings was a victim of circumstance or a monster of his own making. The sentencing phase highlighted the friction between retributive justice and constitutional protections for minors. Ultimately, the jury recommended life with the possibility of parole, reflecting a hesitation to condemn a minor to certain death in prison. However, the judicial system responded with the technical weight of consecutive sentencing. By stacking the life sentences for each of the 5 victims and the assault charges for the survivors, the court effectively engineered a life without parole sentence under the guise of procedural adherence. Michael Bever will likely never breathe free air again, a decision that underscores the judicial system's struggle to reconcile the biological reality of the teenage brain with crimes of such absolute enormity that they defy rehabilitation. The precedent set here suggests that, while the law may protect the abstract concept of the juvenile offender, it yields when faced with the concrete horror of mass fratricide. Beyond the clinical assessments and legal maneuvering, the true legacy of the Bever family murders resides with the survivors. Crystal Bever, who was 13 at the time, and her younger sister Autumn, who was 2, became the sole remnants of the family unit. Crystal's survival is a testament to extraordinary physiological resilience and presence of mind. Despite suffering a slashed throat and stab wounds to her stomach and arms, she managed to alert emergency services and identify her brothers as the attackers. Her testimony provided the human counterweight to the sterile horror of the diaries. In the years following the trial, the trajectory of the survivors has been shielded from the public eye to protect their recovery. Yet their existence serves as a permanent rebuke to the brothers' goal of total annihilation. The physical site of the tragedy underwent a transformation that mirrors the community's attempt to heal. The house on Magnolia Court, initially standing as a macabre tourist attraction for those fascinated by the macabre, became a source of distress for the neighbors who had listened to the siren scream through the night in 2015. In a twist of continued violence, the vacant home was gutted by arson in 2017, before it could be formally demolished. The city of Broken Arrow eventually razed the charred structure, erasing the architectural footprint of the murders. In its place, the quintessential suburban lot was converted into a memorial park and garden. This reclaiming of space serves a psychological function for the community, replacing a monument of trauma with a zone of reflection. It is a deliberate act of erasure, denying the killers the shrine of a haunted house. The narrative arc of the Bever family tragedy concludes not with the fame the brothers sought, but with a profound silence. The journals, once intended to be the scriptures of a new generation of mass murderers, are now locked away in evidence vaults, stripped of their power and reduced to clinical exhibits of depravity. The godlike status Robert and Michael craved was dismantled by the mundane reality of prison uniforms and the bureaucratic finality of consecutive sentences. The diary's final entry, which anticipated a world shocked by their actions, was ultimately overshadowed by the resilience of the sister they failed to kill. Crystal Bever's survival ensured that the story, told to the world, was not one of the brothers' power, but of their failure. The room that was silenced by the reading of the diary eventually filled with the sounds of a gavel, bringing down the weight of the law, ensuring that the only legacy Michael Bever leaves behind is a case study in the limits of juvenile mercy. As the prosecution closed the heavy cover of Michael Bever's journal, a suffocating silence descended upon the courtroom, heavier than the air in the quiet, Broken Arrow suburb where the carnage took place. The handwritten pages read aloud with a monotone precision that belied their horrific content, detailed not just a massacre, but a calculated quest for infamy. The entries did not speak of typical teenage angst, but of a methodical plan to liquidate his own bloodline: David, April, Daniel, Christopher, and Victoria, to surpass the kill counts of history's most notorious murderers. The stillness in the room was the collective realization that a 16-year-old boy had looked into the faces of his 5-year-old sister and 12-year-old brothers and saw only statistics for a grim scoreboard. Reflecting on the warning signs missed by parents, David and April Bever requires confronting the total isolation they engineered. They mistook the accumulation of tactical knives, Kevlar, and thousands of rounds of ammunition for survivalist preparation, rather than an impending internal threat, while the boys were removed from the public school system. effectively blinding the teachers and counselors who might have spotted the decaying empathy in Michael's demeanor, the failure was systemic and total. The very walls built by the parents to keep the dangers of the world out became the cage where a monster could gestate unnoticed, hidden from the scrutiny of educators and neighbors alike who might have intervened had the red flags been visible. In the end, the case of the Bever brothers serves as a terrifying testament to the unknowable darkness that can reside behind the eyes of a child. The slaughter of the innocents in that Oklahoma home was not a sudden snap of violence, but a drafted itinerary of destruction. As the final sentence was processed, the room was left with the haunting echo of Michael's written words, a permanent reminder that the most dangerous predators are sometimes the ones sleeping down the hall, and that the most fragile lives can be extinguished by the very hands meant to hold them.